The thing about empires is they're built on the assumption that someone, somewhere, is always following the rules, which makes it particularly inconvenient when a maintenance engineer named Hana decides to throw 2 centuries of carefully crafted xenophobic legislation straight out the nearest airlock. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Hadrian's fall wasn't the kind of place you'd expect a galactic revolution to start. Hell, it wasn't the kind of place you'd expect much of anything to start, except maybe a particularly aggressive case of cabin fever. The mining station hung in the void like a rusty tumor, extracting precious metals from the asteroid belt, while its crew of 43 souls slowly went mad from the isolation and recycled air. Hana had been breathing that recycled air for 18 months, and if you asked her, it was starting to taste like disappointment and broken dreams. She was 32, compact as a coiled spring, with grease under her fingernails and the kind of practical intelligence that could jury-rig a plasma conduit with spare parts and spite. The Galactic Coalition had assigned her to Hadrian's fall because she was good at fixing things that shouldn't be fixable, which, as it turned out, was excellent preparation for what came next. The galaxy, you see, had learned some hard lessons about mixing species. The great integration wars of the 23rd century had taught everyone that different evolutionary paths led to incompatibilities. Some species were builders, some were traders, some were philosophers, and some were what the coalition euphemistically called apex predators, though the more accurate term was nightmare fuel with opposable thumbs. The Sixtar fell squarely into that last category. 200 years ago, during what history books blandly referred to as the Red Moon Massacres, a Sixtar pack had torn through 3 human colonies like a plasma cutter through tissue paper. The death toll was, let's just say the coalition's response was swift, decisive, and involved a lot of very large explosions. The surviving Sixtar were banished to the Outer Rim, forbidden from setting foot, or claw, or whatever they had, in civilized space. The ban had held for 2 centuries. The galaxy was peaceful, orderly, and absolutely convinced that keeping dangerous species locked away was the key to continued existence. Which brings us back to Tuesday morning, station time, when Hana was elbow-deep in the waste recycling unit, cursing the day she'd ever heard of quantum flux capacitors. The recycling bay was exactly as glamorous as it sounds. A metal cathedral of rotating drums, conveyor belts, and the constant hum of machinery that turned garbage into slightly different garbage. Hana was following the source of a persistent rattle that had been driving everyone insane for 3 days, when she heard something that definitely wasn't mechanical. A whimper. Now, whimpers in a waste facility could mean a lot of things, most of them involving injured crew members and workmen's compensation claims. But this whimper had a quality that made the hair on Hana's arms stand up. Something wild and desperate and utterly alien. She followed the sound deeper into the machinery, squeezing between conveyor belts and ducking under sorting arms, until she found herself in a maintenance alcove that hadn't seen human attention in months. And there, huddled in a nest of torn insulation and metal shavings, was something that made her heart stop. It was about the size of a house cat, if house cats had obsidian black fur, silver markings that seemed to shift in the light, and eyes like molten gold. Its limbs were too long, its claws too sharp, and when it looked up at her with those impossible eyes, Hana felt a primal recognition that went straight to her lizard brain and started screaming. Sixtar cub. She should have backed away, should have called security, should have followed about 17 different protocols that would have resulted in the creature's immediate incineration and her own commendation for species vigilance. Instead, she noticed that one of its legs was bent at an angle that definitely wasn't natural, and that its breathing was shallow and rapid. It was starving, injured, and alone. About as far from a terrifying apex predator as you could get. "Well," she whispered, and her voice echoed strangely in the small space. "This is either going to be the stupidest thing I've ever done, or just Tuesday. Haven't decided yet." The cub didn't respond, which was probably for the best, since Hana was already reaching into her toolkit for the emergency medical supplies she kept for minor workplace injuries, because apparently her definition of workplace injury was flexible enough to include accidentally found a baby space wolf. Getting him, and she was pretty sure it was a him, though 6-tar biology wasn't exactly covered in standard coalition educational materials, back to her quarters without being seen required the kind of creative problem-solving that would have impressed her engineering instructors. It involved maintenance shafts, a repurposed equipment cart, and a level of casual rule-breaking that would have given her mother nightmares. Hana's quarters were exactly what you'd expect from a mining station. 12 square meters of efficiency, with a fold-down bunk, a tiny desk, and storage compartments built into every available surface. It wasn't designed for pets, which was probably why pets were strictly forbidden on Hadrian's fall. Lucky for her, the Coalition's pet regulations didn't specifically mention illegal alien predators, which was either an oversight or a failure of imagination. She set up a nest in the storage compartment under her desk, lined it with spare clothing, and gently placed the cub inside. He didn't resist, which was either a good sign or a very bad one, depending on your perspective. The next few hours were a crash course in interspecies veterinary medicine. The broken leg turned out to be a clean fracture, easy enough to splint with some spare conduit and medical tape. The malnutrition was trickier. Standard human food was obviously out, but Hana's emergency rations included a variety of protein supplements that seemed to work. By the end of her shift, the cub was looking marginally less like death warmed over. He'd even managed to keep down some food, though he'd eyed her with deep suspicion throughout the entire process. "I'm going to call you Bolt," she announced, settling onto her bunk and looking down at her new roommate. "Because you showed up like lightning, and because if anyone finds out about you, we're both going to need to bolt for the nearest escape pod." Bolt's response was to curl up in his makeshift nest and go to sleep, which Hana took as approval. That night, as she lay in her bunk listening to the station's endless mechanical symphony, Hana reflected on the magnitude of what she'd just done. Harboring an illegal alien was a Class A felony. Harboring a 6-tar specifically carried a mandatory death sentence, no appeals, no exceptions. The Coalition didn't believe in taking chances when it came to apex predators, but looking down at the sleeping cub, at Bolt, with his 2 long limbs tucked under him and his breathing finally steady and calm, she found it hard to reconcile the Coalition's monster stories with the reality of a scared, injured baby who'd somehow ended up alone in a waste facility. "What the hell?" she whispered to the darkness. "Everyone needs a hobby." Outside her porthole, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small act of rebellion that had just taken place in quarters 7C. The galaxy continued its stately rotation. The Coalition continued its vigilant watch, and somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of interstellar governance, absolutely no one suspected that their carefully maintained order was about to be upended by a maintenance engineer with a soft heart and a complete inability to mind her own business. It was, Hana would later reflect, exactly the kind of Tuesday that changed everything. 6 months later, Hana was beginning to understand why the coalition had such strict policies about apex predators. It wasn't the claws, though Bolt's had grown impressively sharp. It wasn't the teeth, though his canines could now puncture hull plating. It wasn't even the way he could move through the maintenance shafts like liquid shadow, which would have been terrifying if it wasn't so damn useful for retrieving dropped tools. No, the real problem was that Bolt had developed opinions. "I don't care if you think the quantum flux regulator is installed backwards," Hana muttered, wrestling with a particularly stubborn coupling. "The manual says it goes this way, and I'm the one with opposable thumbs and an engineering degree." Bolt, now roughly the size of a medium dog but with the proportions of something designed by a committee of nightmares, sat on his haunches and made a sound that was part purr, part growl, and entirely judgmental. His golden eyes tracked every movement of her hands, and when she finally got the coupling locked in place, he padded over and nosed at a different component entirely. "That's the primary intake valve," Hana said. "It's fine. See? All the readings are—" The readings were not fine. In fact, they were spectacularly not fine, indicating a pressure differential that should have been impossible given the current configuration. Hana stared at the display, then at Bolt, then at the coupling she'd just installed. "Son of a bitch," she whispered, and began reversing her work. This had been happening more and more lately. Bolt would watch her work with an intensity that suggested he was actually following the engineering principles involved, and then, with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never heard of formal education, he'd point out problems that shouldn't have been visible to anyone without advanced technical training. It was deeply unfair. Hana had spent 4 years at the Coalition Engineering Academy learning thermodynamics and quantum mechanics and structural analysis. Bolt had spent 6 months eating protein supplements and chewing on spare cables. Yet somehow his instinctive understanding of complex systems was starting to surpass her own. "You know," came a voice from behind her, "talking to yourself is usually the first sign of space madness." Hana didn't jump, which was a testament to her nerves, and didn't immediately shove Bolt into the nearest maintenance hatch, which was a testament to her trust in Tobias Grimm. Her best friend and fellow engineer stood in the doorway, tool belt slung over his shoulder, and that familiar expression of amused curiosity on his weathered face. Tobias was what you'd get if you crossed a scarecrow with a particularly intelligent wrench, all angles and joints and practical intelligence. He'd been on Hadrian's Fall for 3 years, which made him practically a veteran, and he had the kind of observational skills that came from spending too much time in small spaces with the same 42 people. Make that 43, if you counted Bolt. Which Tobias was definitely doing right now, his eyes fixed on the black furred form that had gone perfectly still beside the quantum flux regulator. The silence stretched between them like a live wire. Hana's mind raced through possible explanations: hallucination, elaborate hoax, temporary insanity, but settled on the truth, because Tobias had known her long enough to see through any lie she could construct on short notice. "So," Tobias said conversationally, "that's either the galaxy's most impressive robot dog, or you've been hiding a Class A xenobiological hazard in your quarters for the better part of a year." 6 months, Hana corrected automatically, then winced. "I mean, what?" Tobias stepped into the maintenance bay and closed the door behind him, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one. Bolt's ears, which were less ears than mobile sensor arrays, swiveled to track his movement, but the six-tar remained motionless. "You know what gave it away?" Tobias asked, settling cross-legged on the floor with the kind of careful nonchalance that suggested he was trying very hard not to appear threatening. The supply discrepancies. Someone's been requisitioning about 30% more protein supplements than the station manifest should require. And before you ask, yes, I've been tracking it, because someone has to maintain our inventory systems. And apparently, that someone is me. Hana felt her stomach drop somewhere around her ankles. Tobias, also, he continued, the power consumption in your quarters has been consistently elevated for months. Not enough to trigger automatic alerts, but enough to show up if someone was specifically looking. Which I was, because my best friend has been acting like she's harboring a terrible secret. And I was worried she'd developed a gambling addiction or started manufacturing illegal stimulants. This is worse, Hana said quietly. Yeah, I figured that out when I saw the apex predator. Bolt chose that moment to abandon his statue impression and pad over to Tobias, who went very still as several kilograms of evolutionary perfection sniffed delicately at his boots. After a moment that felt like several years, Bolt sat down and made a sound that was almost like a cat's purr. If cats were the size of wolves and designed for ripping apart prey twice their size. Well, Tobias said, his voice only slightly strained, he seems friendly. His name is Bolt, Hana said, because once you'd crossed the line from law-abiding citizen to harboring illegal aliens, you might as well commit to the insanity. I found him in the waste recycling bay. He was injured and alone, and I couldn't just leave him there. Tobias looked from Bolt to Hana and back again, his expression cycling through several stages of disbelief. Hana, do you have any idea what the penalty is for harboring a six-star? Death, she said simply. No trial, no appeals, no exceptions. I know. And you did it anyway. I did it anyway. Tobias was quiet for a long moment, watching as Bolt padded back to his position beside the quantum flux regulator and resumed his quality control inspection. Finally, he shook his head with the kind of weary acceptance that came from years of friendship with someone who had a terminal case of doing the right thing regardless of consequences. You realize this makes me an accessory, he said. Only if you don't report it. And you realize I'm not going to report it. I was hoping. You were counting on it, you mean? Tobias stood up, brushing dust off his coveralls. Damn it, Hana. When I said I was worried about you developing bad habits, I was thinking more along the lines of drinking synthetic alcohol or dating maintenance droids. This seemed more practical. The routine they developed over the following weeks was the kind of elaborate deception that would have impressed professional spies. Tobias took over requisitioning supplies, spreading the orders across multiple departments to avoid detection. Hana modified her quarters' power distribution to mask Bolt's presence. They developed a complex system of signals and coded communications that would have done credit to a resistance movement, which, in a way, it was. The first real test came when Commander Aldrich Thorne announced a surprise inspection of all crew quarters. Thorne was the kind of military officer who'd been carved from granite and then polished to an uncomfortable shine. All sharp edges and rigid discipline, and an attention to detail that bordered on the pathological. He'd been assigned to Hadrian's Fall specifically because the Coalition needed someone who could maintain order in the kind of isolated environment that turned normal people into gibbering lunatics. Inspection starts at 0800 tomorrow, he announced during the daily briefing, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown engineers check their tool inventories. Full quarters sweep, all personal items catalogued, any irregularities reported immediately. Hana managed to keep her expression neutral, but she could feel sweat beading on her forehead. Beside her, Tobias developed a sudden fascination with his duty roster, which was probably wise, since his poker face had never been particularly impressive. That night, they moved Bolt to the most secure hiding place they could think of, the primary atmospheric recycling plant, deep in the station's mechanical bowels, where even the most thorough inspection was unlikely to venture. It was a calculated risk. If something went wrong with the air supply, Bolt would be discovered immediately. But it was better than the alternative. The inspection itself was exactly as pleasant as expected. Thorne moved through each crew member's quarters like a human scanning device, noting every personal item, every minor deviation from regulation, every hint that the people under his command might have developed individual personalities during their deployment. When he reached Hana's quarters, she stood at attention while he methodically examined every surface, every storage compartment, every possible hiding place. His eyes lingered on the slightly modified power distribution panel, and for a moment she was certain he'd detected the modifications. "Interesting work," he said finally. "Improved efficiency?" "About 15%, Hana managed. I documented the modifications in my engineering log." Thorne nodded and moved on, leaving Hana with the distinct impression that she'd just passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. But the real crisis came 2 days later, when Imperial Inquisitor Petra Blackwater arrived on Hadrian's fall. Inquisitors were the Coalition's answer to problems that couldn't be solved with paperwork or committee meetings. They had unlimited authority, no oversight, and a mandate to preserve galactic security by any means necessary. Blackwater was particularly renowned for her work in xenobiological threat assessment, which was a polite way of saying she hunted down dangerous aliens and eliminated them with extreme prejudice. She was also, Hana noticed with growing dread, missing her left arm from the elbow down. "I'm investigating reports of unusual energy signatures in this sector," Blackwater announced during her introductory briefing. Her voice carried the kind of cold authority that made Thorne's military bearing look warm and cuddly by comparison. Specifically, biological energy signatures that don't match any known Coalition species. Hana felt her blood turn to ice water. Six-tar physiology included bioelectric organs that helped them navigate in darkness. Organs that would definitely register as unusual energy signatures to the right kind of sensors. "The investigation will be thorough," Blackwater continued, her remaining hand resting casually on what looked like a very expensive weapon. "Any crew member found to be harboring illegal biological materials will be subject to immediate questioning and potential execution." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crew, and Hana had the uncomfortable feeling that those dark eyes lingered on her just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I trust," Blackwater said, "that everyone will cooperate fully with my investigation." That night, huddled in the atmospheric recycling plant with Bolt pressed against her side, Hana finally allowed herself to consider the possibility that her good intentions might have doomed them all. The six-sitar cub had grown considerably in the past 6 months. He was now large enough to be genuinely dangerous, if he chose to be, with claws that could shred metal and reflexes that put human reaction times to shame. But as she watched him sleep, curled up like an oversized house cat despite his fearsome appearance, she found it impossible to regret her decision. Whatever else Bolt might be, he was also the creature who'd learned to bring her tools when she was working in hard-to-reach places, who'd somehow intuited the principles of quantum engineering without any formal training, and who purred like a contented engine when she scratched behind his distinctly non-terrestrial ears. The galaxy might see him as a monster, but Hana saw him as family, which, as it turned out, was exactly the kind of thinking that started revolutions. The universe, Hana had learned, had a particularly twisted sense of timing. Just when you thought you'd managed to keep your illegal alien predator hidden from the Imperial Inquisitor, who'd arrived specifically to hunt down illegal alien predators, the mining station decided to have a catastrophic structural failure. It started, as these things often do, with a sound that shouldn't exist. Hana was in Engineering Bay 7, pretending to run diagnostics while actually worrying about Bolt's hiding place in the atmospheric recycling plant, when the entire station shuddered like a wounded animal. The lights flickered, gravity wavered for a stomach-churning moment, and somewhere deep in Hadrian's Fall's mechanical heart, something expensive broke, with a sound like the universe clearing its throat. "All hands! All hands!" Commander Thorne's voice crackled over the comm system, carrying the kind of controlled urgency that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "We have a collapse in mining shaft 12. Repeat, structural collapse in mining shaft 12. Emergency response teams to stations immediately." Hana was moving before the announcement finished, her engineer's instincts overriding her paranoia about discovery. Mining shaft collapses were exactly the kind of emergency that required all hands, no exceptions, and exactly the kind of situation that turned dangerous fast if you didn't respond immediately. What she found in the mining sector made her stomach drop somewhere around her boots. Mining Shaft 12 had been one of their primary extraction sites, a complex network of tunnels and chambers that extended nearly 2 kilometers into the asteroid's core. Had been, past tense, because now it was a twisted mess of collapsed support beams, shattered rock, and enough debris to bury a small city. "How many?" she asked Tobias, who was already setting up portable floodlights around the disaster site. 15 crew members were working the deep extraction when it happened, he said grimly. "We've got comm contact with 8 of them. They're trapped in Chamber 7, about 800 meters down. The others—" He shrugged helplessly. Chamber 7 was past 3 separate collapse zones, through a maze of unstable tunnels that could finish coming down at any moment. It was also, according to the hastily assembled rescue team, completely inaccessible to standard rescue equipment. The passages were too narrow, too unstable, and too filled with debris for conventional approaches. "Estimated time until we can bore a new access shaft?" Commander Thorne asked the chief mining engineer, a grizzled veteran named Davison who looked like he'd been personally carved from asteroid rock. 48 hours minimum, Davison replied. "Maybe 72 if we hit unexpected mineral deposits." "Atmospheric readings?" "Chamber 7 has maybe 18 hours of air left. 20 if they stay calm and conserve oxygen." The math was ugly and getting worse. 18 hours of air, 48 hours minimum rescue time, and 8 people, including, Hana had learned with growing horror, 2 children whose parents worked the mining shifts, slowly suffocating in the dark. Inquisitor Blackwater, who had been observing the rescue efforts, with the detached interest of someone evaluating a tactical exercise, finally spoke up. "What about using automated probe units, small enough to navigate the debris, equipped with emergency supplies?" "Tried it," Davison said. "The electromagnetic interference from all that twisted metal is scrambling their navigation systems. They get maybe 50 meters before they start flying in circles." Hana found herself staring at the 3-dimensional map of the collapsed tunnels, her mind automatically tracing possible routes through the maze of debris. There had to be a way. There was always a way, if you were creative enough, desperate enough, or stupid enough to think outside conventional parameters. And then, with the sudden clarity that comes with truly terrible ideas, she realized what that way might be. "I need to check on the atmospheric recycling plant," she announced, backing away from the rescue coordination area. "Make sure all this dust and debris isn't clogging our air filters." It was a reasonable excuse that got her away from the crowd without raising suspicions. What it didn't do was prepare her for what she was about to suggest to Bolt. She found him exactly where she'd left him, curled up between two massive air processing units in a space that would have been cramped for a human, but seemed perfectly comfortable for a creature designed by evolution to fit through impossibly tight spaces. His golden eyes opened as soon as she entered the chamber, and his ears swiveled toward her with the kind of focused attention that suggested he'd been listening to the station's emergency broadcasts. "Hey, big guy," she said softly, settling down beside him. "We've got a problem." Over the next 10 minutes, using a combination of words, gestures, and the kind of simplified technical drawings that she hoped would translate across species barriers, Hana explained the situation. 8 people trapped, narrow tunnels, limited time, standard rescue impossible. Bolt listened with the intensity of someone following a complex engineering lecture. His head tilted at an angle that suggested he was processing not just her words, but the underlying implications. When she finished, he padded over to the tunnel schematics she'd sketched on a spare piece of metal plating, and studied them with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for quantum mechanics equations. After a moment, he looked up at her and made a sound that was part question, part statement, and entirely clear in its meaning. "You want me to go in there." "I know it's dangerous," Hana said. "I know it goes against every survival instinct you have. But you're small enough to fit through spaces that would stop anyone else. Fast enough to avoid falling debris. And your senses are good enough to navigate in the dark without getting lost." Bolt considered this, then padded back to the schematics and nosed at a specific section of tunnel. One of the narrowest passages, barely wide enough for a human to crawl through. "That's the worst part," Hana admitted. "Right there, the tunnel drops about 20 meters through a vertical shaft that's probably full of loose rock. It's basically a death trap for anything larger than a house cat." Bolt made another sound, this one carrying a distinctly sarcastic tone that suggested he was well aware of the risks involved. Then he looked directly at her with those impossible golden eyes and did something that made her heart clench with a mixture of pride and terror. He nodded. Getting Bolt to the mining sector without being seen required the kind of creative logistics that would have impressed military strategists. Hana and Tobias created a diversion by triggering a minor malfunction in the station's secondary power grid. Nothing dangerous, just enough to require immediate attention from most of the crew. While everyone was focused on the electrical problem, they smuggled Bolt through the maintenance shafts to mining shaft 12. The entrance to the collapsed tunnel system looked like the mouth of some massive creature that had decided to swallow half the asteroid. Emergency lights cast harsh shadows across the twisted metal and broken rock, creating a landscape that belonged in nightmares rather than engineering manuals. "You sure about this?" Tobias asked quietly, watching as Bolt sniffed delicately at the entrance to the debris field. "No," Hana said honestly, "but I'm sure about the alternative." Bolt padded into the wreckage with the fluid grace that had made the 6 tar such effective hunters. Within moments, he'd disappeared into the maze of collapsed tunnels, moving through spaces that would have been impassable for any other living creature on the station. The next 3 hours were the longest of Hana's life. She and Tobias maintained radio contact with the trapped miners, providing updates on the rescue effort while carefully not mentioning that their rescue team consisted of one illegally harbored apex predator and a lot of hope. Commander Thorne coordinated the conventional rescue efforts, boring equipment working around the clock to create a new access shaft. Inquisitor Blackwater continued her investigation, though the mining disaster had temporarily diverted her attention from hunting for unusual energy signatures. And somewhere in the twisted wreckage of Mining Shaft 12, Bolt navigated through darkness and debris toward the trapped miners. The first sign that he'd reached them came over the emergency comm channel. A child's voice, high and excited, cutting through the static. "Mommy! Mommy, there's something here. It's got big gold eyes and it's really pretty. And it brought us food." Hana closed her eyes and felt her heart stop. "Emergency food supplies have reached the trapped miners," she announced over the general comm channel, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Unknown delivery method, possibly automated probe units functioning better than expected." It was a thin excuse that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, but it bought them time. Over the next hour, Bolt made 3 more trips through the debris field, each time carrying emergency supplies, medical equipment, and hope to the trapped miners. By the 4th trip, he was guiding them out. The first survivor to emerge from the tunnel system was mining technician Reeves, a grizzled veteran who'd been on Hadrian's Fall longer than almost anyone. He stumbled into the emergency staging area covered in dust and rock debris, blinking in the harsh lights like someone emerging from a cave. "How?" Commander Thorne demanded. "How did you get through the debris field?" Reeves looked around the assembled rescue team, his expression cycling through confusion, gratitude, and something that might have been awe. Something helped us, guided us through the tunnels, knew exactly which passages were safe, which ones to avoid." "Automated probe unit?" Thorne pressed. "No, sir," Reeves said slowly. "This was something else, something alive." One by one, the other survivors emerged from the tunnels, each with a similar story. Something had found them in the darkness. Something had brought them supplies. Something had led them to safety through passages that should have been impassable. The children were less circumspect. "It was like a big space dog," 8-year-old Jenny Morrison announced to anyone who would listen. "With pretty gold eyes and really soft fur, and it made nice sounds when I petted it." "It was scary at first," added her brother Tommy. "But then it saved us. So I think it's a good monster." Inquisitor Blackwater, who had been observing the rescue operation with professional interest, suddenly went very still. Her remaining hand moved instinctively toward her weapon, and her scarred face took on an expression that was part recognition, part rage, and entirely dangerous. "Describe this creature," she said quietly, kneeling down to Jenny's eye level. "Exactly." "It was about this big," Jenny said, spreading her arms wide, "with black fur and silver stripes and the prettiest eyes you ever saw. And when it purred, it sounded like the engine in Daddy's mining suit." Blackwater stood up slowly, her face pale beneath the emergency lighting. "Commander Thorne, I need to speak with you immediately. Privately." But before Thorne could respond, before Blackwater could voice whatever suspicions were clearly forming in her mind, the emergency comm system crackled to life with a transmission that changed everything. "Emergency broadcast to Hadrian's Fall," came an unfamiliar voice. "This is Captain Morrison of the Coalition News Service ship Truth Seeker. We've been monitoring your emergency frequencies and recording your rescue operation for the past 3 hours. The footage of the Six-Tar conducting the rescue has already been transmitted to the Galactic communication network." Silence fell over the mining sector like a physical weight. "Repeat, we have recorded footage of a Six-Tar actively saving human lives. The recording has been transmitted and is currently being broadcast across 17 Coalition worlds. Please respond." Commander Thorne's hand moved toward his comm unit, then stopped. His eyes found Hana's across the crowded staging area, and in them she saw a mixture of understanding, resignation, and something that might have been approval. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose the secret's out." Inquisitor Blackwater's face had gone from pale to absolutely murderous. Her remaining hand was now resting on her weapon, and her voice carried the kind of cold fury that preceded very unpleasant consequences. "Someone on this station has been harboring a six-tar," she said, "in direct violation of Coalition law, Imperial decree, and basic galactic security protocols. That someone is going to be executed, and the creature is going to be destroyed. Immediately." She looked around the assembled crew, her gaze sharp enough to cut metal. "I want the guilty party to step forward. Now." Hana felt the weight of 43 pairs of eyes on her, felt the moment stretch like a live wire between heartbeats. This was it. The end of her career, her life, and probably Bolt's as well. But at least 8 people were alive who would have died without him. At least 2 children would see their families again. At least she'd proven that the Coalition's monster stories weren't the whole truth. She was opening her mouth to confess when Commander Thorne stepped forward. "That would be me, Inquisitor," he said calmly. "I've been harboring the six-tar for approximately 6 months." The staging area erupted in shocked murmurs, but Thorne continued speaking as if he'd just announced the dinner menu. "The creature was discovered injured and alone in our waste processing facility. Rather than execute what was obviously a juvenile specimen, I decided to observe its behavior and assess its potential threat level. What I found was an intelligent, cooperative being capable of complex problem-solving and, as we've just seen, heroic action." Blackwater stared at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who just claimed that gravity was optional. "You're lying," she said flatly. "Station commanders don't make decisions like that without authorization. Someone else found the creature and convinced you to protect them." "Prove it," Thorne replied. And that, as it turned out, was when the revolution truly began. What happened next was the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that Coalition administrators would spend decades trying to explain away. Within 6 hours of the rescue footage hitting the Galactic communication network, 17 worlds had declared their intention to review the Six-Tar Prohibition Act. Within 12 hours, 3 Coalition senators had called for emergency hearings on interspecies relations. Within 18 hours, protesters were marching on Capitol Prime, carrying signs that read, "Heroes don't have species," and "Let them live." And on Hadrian's fall, Inquisitor Blackwater was having what could charitably be described as a complete professional meltdown. "This is not negotiable," she snarled, her remaining hand gesturing wildly at the comm displays showing the spreading civil unrest. "The Six-Tar are apex predators. They are killers. They are exactly the kind of threat the Coalition was created to prevent." Commander Thorne, who had been receiving increasingly frantic messages from Coalition Command for the past hour, maintained the kind of military calm that came from years of dealing with impossible situations. "The Six-Tar in question," he said evenly, "just saved 8 human lives, including 2 children. That footage is now being broadcast on every major news network in Coalition space." "It's a manipulation," Blackwater snapped. "A trick. You don't understand what these creatures are capable of." She cut herself off abruptly, her scarred face going pale. For a moment, the fury in her eyes was replaced by something that looked disturbingly like terror. "I was there," she said quietly, "during the Outer Rim incident 15 years ago. The one that didn't make the official reports. A Six-Tar pack had cornered a survey team on Kepler 442b. 12 civilians, including children. When our rescue team arrived, we found—" She swallowed hard. "We found pieces." She held up her prosthetic arm, the advanced mechanics gleaming under the emergency lights. This is what their claws do to human tissue. This is what they are. The staging area fell silent. In the distance, Hana could hear the station's ventilation systems humming, the eternal background noise of recycled air and artificial gravity that marked the boundary between life and the void. "Where is the creature now?" Blackwater demanded. Before anyone could answer, Bolt padded out of the tunnel system. He was larger than Hana remembered. The stress and exertion of the rescue had somehow made his alien nature more apparent. His obsidian fur rippled with each movement, the silver markings seeming to shift and flow in the harsh lighting. His golden eyes swept across the assembled humans with an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient. And when those eyes found Blackwater, something changed in his posture. The Inquisitor went rigid, her hand moving instinctively to her weapon. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the pack leader from Kepler, 442b. Bolt took a step forward, and Blackwater took a step back. 15 years, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. 15 years, I've been hunting you. What happened next was the kind of moment that changes the course of history, though nobody present would realize it until much later. Bolt, apex predator of the six-star species, terror of the Outer Rim, and nightmare of coalition security forces, did something completely unprecedented. He sat down. And then, in full view of the emergency staging area, the rescue crews, Commander Thorne, Inquisitor Blackwater, and the news crew that was still broadcasting live to 17 worlds, he rolled over onto his back and made a sound that was unmistakably an apology. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either diplomatic breakthroughs or complete civilizational collapse. "He's surrendering," Blackwater said, her voice barely audible. Bolt rolled back to his feet and padded slowly toward the Inquisitor. Blackwater raised her weapon, her finger on the trigger, but something in the creature's posture, submissive, non-threatening, almost humble, made her hesitate. When Bolt reached her, he did something that would be replayed on news broadcasts for decades. He gently nuzzled her prosthetic arm with his massive head, then sat down beside her and began to purr. "The pack," Blackwater whispered. They were starving. The colony ships had disrupted their hunting grounds, and they were desperate. You were just trying to survive." She looked around the staging area, her expression cycling through confusion, understanding, and something that might have been hope. "Commander," came a new voice over the comm system, "this is Coalition Command. We're receiving reports of massive civil demonstrations on 14 worlds. The Senate has called an emergency session. You are ordered to maintain status quo until further notice." Thorne keyed his comm unit. "Understood, Command. Status quo maintained." 5 years later, Hana stood in the main conference room of the newly established Interspecies Integration Institute, watching through the massive viewing port as the first mixed-species colony ship prepared for launch. The vessel carried humans, Altarians, Centauri traders, and, in a move that still made coalition traditionalists break out in nervous sweats, a small pack of six-star who had volunteered to serve as scouts and emergency responders. "Strange how things work out," Tobias said, joining her at the viewport. He wore the insignia of the Institute's Chief Engineering Officer, a promotion that had come with their new roles in the post-revolution galaxy. "Not strange," Hana replied, watching as Bolt, now officially designated as Ambassador Bolt, first speaker for the Six-Star Collective, supervised the loading of emergency supplies. "Just proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to an empire is show it compassion." In the distance, the colony ship's engines flared to life, carrying its diverse crew toward a future that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. And somewhere in the depths of space, the old order continued its slow transformation into something unprecedented in galactic history. All because a lonely maintenance engineer had once found an injured cub in a waste recycling bay, and decided that survival was less important than doing the right thing. The revolution, as it turned out, had been hiding in her quarters all along.